You're watching The Legal Breakdown. So, Glenn, we've got some rare surprise bad news for Donald Trump at the hands of the U.S. Supreme Court. Can you explain what just happened here?
Yeah, Brian, the state of Missouri thought it would be a good idea to sue the state of New York to try to put a stop to Donald Trump's criminal prosecution. More precisely, they wanted the gag order to be lifted, and they wanted his sentencing date to be delayed to, I suppose, after the election. I mean, this is actually the state of Missouri weaponizing the whole criminal justice system for political purposes. Not that that should come as a shock to anybody, but perhaps what might come as a shock to some, given the track record of our Supreme Court lately, even the Supreme Court smacked this down. They said, no, Missouri, more precisely, the Attorney General for the state of Missouri, a guy named Andrew Bailey, they said, no, this is not a well-placed lawsuit, and they summarily rejected it. So, this attempt by the state of Missouri to use the system for transparently political purposes and interfere in the criminal prosecution of another state is basically dead in the water.
Glenn, is the problem here, as far as the Supreme Court's concerned, just that Missouri didn't have standing to bring this suit, or that they didn't agree with anybody bringing this suit because Donald Trump's impending sentencing in New York is completely valid?
We can't answer that question. Why? Because it was basically a one-sentence denial from the Supreme Court saying, no, we will not accept filing of this suit, period. But they didn't talk about whether that was because there was a standing issue. One state doesn't have standing. In other words, in layman's terms, standing means you got to have a personal dog in the fight in order to bring suit against somebody else. So just because I'm aggrieved, if my rights aren't directly impacted and affected, I can't bring a suit. So it may be that they rejected it on standing grounds. It may be that this was what we call a political question. There's something called the political question doctrine, and courts are not supposed to wade into, states that are having political battles with one another as opposed to legal battles. But we don't know because it was a one-sentence denial. A little interesting footnote, there was a notation in the denial from the Supreme Court that said, 2 Supreme Court justices would have accepted this lawsuit. They would have
surprise.
the file. And I'll give you a guess as to who they are, Brian.
Yeah, please let these be my lottery ticket numbers, because I can tell you exactly who those 2 Supreme Court justices are. Glenn, let me ask you this. Is there anything that we can glean from this? Because I think so much of what you and I have spoken about in the last several months, as far as the Supreme Court's concerned, as they've descended deeper and deeper into this just overt, shameless betrayal of the Constitution and deference to Donald Trump, is that it kind of feels as if there's no reason for the Supreme Court to even hide it anymore, what their goal in all of this is. So when we see a moment like this, where we kind of get whiplash at the fact that the U.S. Supreme Court, which will bend over backwards to be deferential to Donald Trump, it kind of throws us off completely. So what can you read from something like this?
Yeah, it's like a really bad guy doing an occasional good thing. It does not restore my faith in the Supreme Court, more precisely the sort of 6 members of the radical right wing of the Supreme Court. But listen, thank goodness for small favors. I'm happy that they did not accept this suit for filing. And let me just tell our viewers, because it seems a little odd that they're trying to file a lawsuit in the Supreme Court, right? Because the way we ordinarily think of how a case gets to the Supreme Court is it goes to a trial court and then an appellate court, and then they appeal or seek review by the Supreme Court, and the Supreme Court either takes it or not. But there's something called original jurisdiction. And when one state sues another state, the problem is you can't really bring that case in the courts of either state. So the Supreme Court has what's called original jurisdiction. They can actually take a lawsuit without it having to go through the normal process when it's one state suing another state. But they said, listen, there is absolutely no reason for us to accept this filing, with the exception of Clarence Thomas and Justice Alito saying, we would accept it. However, there's a notation in the denial from the Supreme Court that says, even though those 2 justices said they would accept it, they said they would not issue any other remedies. In other words, they wouldn't put a temporary stay in place to put a stop to anything that was going on in the New York state court system in Donald Trump's criminal prosecution. But Brian, like I say, thank goodness for small favors, because think back to the 60 or 65 election challenge cases that Donald Trump's nefarious lawyers filed when he lost the 2020 election. The Supreme Court could easily have taken one of those cases for review and put their thumb on the scale, but they didn't. They let Donald Trump's loss stand. And here they go again, at least in the election challenge arena. They opted not to put their thumb on the scale. Now, I will have my faith restored when they restore women's constitutional privacy rights and LGBTQ plus rights and affirmative action, giving minorities an equal chance at, educational opportunities. So, if they want to rebuild faith, confidence, and trust in the Supreme Court, they're going to need to do a whole lot more than what they did today.
It is an interesting strategy, though. The way that the Republican Party as a whole wanted to get this thing in front of the Supreme Court is that they actually needed another state to bring this case, because otherwise it would have to go through the regular channels. It would have to go to the higher courts in New York and then eventually jump its way into the federal court system and go up to the Supreme Court. But by virtue of having another state sue the state of New York over this sentencing, that would virtually guarantee that it would get to the U.S. Supreme Court, which is where these Republicans wanted to get in the first place. So it goes to show that they clearly see the Supreme Court as being an extension of the Republican Party, and they needed to do whatever they could to get this thing in front of the Supreme Court as fast as possible. And so that's why Missouri actually did this. It wasn't just some rogue Republican attorney general looking for attention. This was part of a coordinated strategy that these people put forward, knowing full well that part of that strategy is the 6-member block of the U.S. Supreme Court.
Brian, that's a great point, and let me build on that a little bit, because this attorney general from Missouri, Andrew Bailey, part of what he put in writing was just sort of unbefitting of any lawyer, never mind a state attorney general. Part of his brief sounded like, a Trump post. He railed against 8 years of lawfare brought against Donald Trump. I mean, the fact that an attorney would put that in a pleading that was going to be read by the Supreme Court, basically disqualifies him from the practice of law, in my opinion, as a practical matter. I'm not saying he's going to be referred to bar counsel, but he acted like a little punk in some of what he put in this pleading.
And yet that's essentially a prerequisite for a promotion in today's Republican Party. Let's finish off with this. Does the fact that the Supreme Court swatted down this effort to reject Donald Trump's impending sentencing, do you think that will have any impact on the inevitable appeal attempt by Donald Trump when he is sentenced? Like, he and his lawyers, of course, are going to appeal this thing to the U.S. Supreme Court if they can, regardless of what the sentence is. So does the fact that they already swatted down one effort by Missouri kind of tell us anything in terms of what they'll do if and when Trump appeals this himself?
Yeah, it's a great question. I don't think it will have a direct impact on the course that Donald Trump's New York State Court case will take once he's sentenced and up through the appeals courts. But here's what I think it might do. I think it might send a signal to other states, particularly red states and states where you have Republican governors and attorneys general, trying to engage in this kind of, let me use a legal term, bullshit. This is not the practice of law. This is politics masquerading as something that is appropriate to be handled by the justice system. It's not. So I think it could have a deterrent effect on other states that were contemplating weaponizing the system of justice to try to do Donald Trump's dirty political bidding.
And I should just mention, when you have these Republican attorneys general who are outflanking the U.S. Supreme Court to the right, I mean, this partisan hackery of a Supreme Court, you might have lost the plot. So hopefully this, again, to your exact point, does send a message that that this isn't really going to go anywhere, and so to not even bother wasting your time. With that said, of course, we will continue to stay on top of everything that happens in Donald Trump's New York case and the impending sentencing, as well as the other prosecutions that he's contending with right now. So for those who are watching, if you want to follow along, please make sure to subscribe. The links to both of our channels are right here on this screen. I'm Brian Taylor Cohen.
And I'm Glenn Kirshner.
You're watching The Legal Breakdown.